Hello. The wisest way to practice is not to repeat. The wisest way to practice is to think. The wisest way to practice is to monitor what you do. The wisest way to practice is to evaluate the gestures according to the tempo. Very often, the universal panacea seems to be just practice slowly. Problem is that the gestures, the triggers from the finger, from the knuckle, from the wrist, from the arm, the tendons, the articulation, the tension, the shoulder, the position, how you shift, prepare, anticipate the different situations in which you have to play with the right dynamic and the right tempo that you don't want to take time for, but you want to be anticipatingly prepared, just like as if you were an orchestra by yourself when you play a solo piano piece that has in fact different orchestral components, the winds, the strings, and all cannot be constantly either delayed, arpeggiated, glued with pedal for all bridges. It has to be finger connected if necessary for the harmonic clarity, and the melodic line, which doesn't have a separate right foot pedal. Therefore, you have to have opportunity to prepare at practicing exactly what you would do in the tempo, with lifting of fingers height or shifting of direction speed that corresponds to the tempo, which then metronomically you would get back to the original expected performance tempo by then proportionally making the gesture smaller. Also, another thing that is to be taken in account and that often is overthought by the practicing repetitively student is the rhythm. You have to count independently of your playing as a conductor independently of the orchestra being the fingers and your count being the conductor, not following your fingers by a muscular memory of the gestures of the fingers. You have to be able to also evaluate what is so rarely done, that the dotted rhythms, which are factually the hardest thing to harness because it's either over dotted, tripled, or grace notished, or not taken in account for the articulation, as a wind instrument would say, tongue it, papa, if you do, or you do. And then the separation should not be a gap because of the act of the hammer hitting the strings, compared to lungs, breathing, singing, or playing a wind instrument, or changing direction of bow in a wind string instruments. Both of those families of instruments are, of course, harnessed by their production of sound component, which is our capacity of exhaling with the air and then expressing the voice, the singing, or the wind instrument sounds, or the bow change. But the articulation remains something not natural to pianists, because we have to think of it and hear it. Now, regardless of the acoustics, because if acoustics are very resonant in a room where you play, or the piano responds differently, you're not really responsible for the piano maker nor for the acoustics. You're just responsible for your foot and for your articulation of your fingers, the pedals and the tips of the fingers. Therefore, the rhythm practiced slowly, if it's dotted, should be also progressively tighter, inevitably, when you get closer to the faster tempo towards which you tend to be according to what you think it should be. But if you practice slowly over dotting, then in fact you don't help yourself, because in tempo you'll end up playing grace notes instead of dotted 16th, 8th note, or whichever dotted rhythm notationally it is. I think that is because, especially when Beethoven and his sonatas are filled with that, goes from 16th notes by 4 to triplets by 3 to 8th notes by 2 and back. Whenever Haydn and Mozart use mostly the 4-2 and not the 4-3-2, a beat group of notes. And very often when we try to do switching from 4 to 3, we immediately overstay because we want to slow down, but more than the ratio of the 3 versus 4 a beat, in order to sort of demonstrate that we have a progressive ritenuto rhythmically indicated by the composer, and not the half or the double by 3. And then you have to count the hemiolas when you're in 3-4. You do. And the 3 times 2, the 2 times 3, the bridging over the phrasing that allows you to not always diminish the tension release. The structural organization of your thoughts should be intuitive. And if it's not, then it becomes nourished by an analytical understanding, or observation rather, of the structure, and thinking, why does Beethoven does 1, 2, 3, 1? And this is 1 and 2 and 3 in a 3-2 bar of 2-3-4 bars. So the hemiolas either overlap, either subdivide differently the groups of 8th notes by 3 or by 2 times 3, 3 times 2. Why is that important? Is because, okay, perfectly right, you have to recite every note, and you try to articulate each note, and you want to mention every note, as you need to. That's why you work on the detail, the micro. But very often the gestural affect, Haydn, Beethoven often write it in deep subdivisions by beats, so it's exactly sort of grind. It's almost grounded to the slightest peck. And then performance-wise, it ends up by being rhythmic accelerando in this case. And can be a flow. Should be actually a flow, because sometimes you have to understand the intent compared to the notation and decide for your interpretation that this is the gestural thing. Why? Not because you want to contradict the details of the score, after all is our only medium to the composer. It's because you play with the direction in line with a narrative storytelling that brings you to a phrase. And if you do in Chopin, you're not going to be so searching for the tiny difference of placement. If you do this 5 against 3, when you could have imagined it as a flow. And I find that this kind of cadential, while very detailedly, over-detailedly notated subdivisions and impositions or superpositions rather of rhythms, the composers intended something that results in a flow. Now, regardless of who decides when you should or not totally respect or disrespect, but the details of a notation in order to present the narrative storytelling with the phrases reaching all their aim, because that is more important, is because when you play, you don't play to recite the notes. You decipher the notes, you memorize the notes and the values, and you compare them to other sections that are similar to understand the toolbox usage from a given composer, and you start understanding, like analyzing handwriting. and you start understanding or guessing what the, in fact, insufficient detailed notation hides or masks, which is sometimes just a gestural improvisatory group of fast notes. Now, it doesn't mean that one should be brash and disrespectful with the details. If not, I would be a very, very disrespectful and scholar and teacher to disrespect the students and as well as the composers I'm trying to hopefully bring to be played to their utmost intent by the students. So I'm sort of a hyphen between the dead composer and the questioning student of what they should do with the text, which is our only medium. Again, we stare at it all lessons long, trying to read, guess what is in between the notes. Can we misguess? Yes. Can we be overzealous and play something that, in fact, precisely detailed, deplayed, doesn't render the gestural intent of the composer's perhaps improvisatory situation? It's difficult to know, of course, because the author is not there to tell us. I come up often with this real important dialogues with myself, where I'm my own devil's advocate. What if the octaves were for depth rather than power? Because on a straight strung pianos, the different ranges were obviously not homogeneous, powerful like on the cross-strung pianos. And therefore, in order to regain the balance that was in disfavor of the bass by octaving, as most of the composers wrote in classical and romantic era, on the modern piano it overpowers. And because you cannot take off a note, after all, it's written in octaves, you cannot just say, oh, if they were alive today, they'll be satisfied with the richness of tone of the bass tone without having to octave it, like cello double bass in an orchestra, string section. But then you have to voice, and starting voicing is starting shaping, and then starting shaping is starting manipulating the composer's intent, and the pedals don't correspond to the length of the instruments that they used before. And then, so in ways, you can say their pedaling corresponded to a weaker pedal holding. Therefore, we have to flicker the pedal more often in order, on the more holding pianos pedals today, we establish the soundscape that they were searching for. And sometimes, especially with Beethoven and Fauré, who both got deaf in their second half of their creative life, then we can even not know how they heard it, because they heard it inside their ear, not even monitoring it with their outside ear according to the instrument on which they composed it, nonetheless. And so we have a translation to do from the text's understanding and from the intent that we probably project our own wish, hope, analytical or intuitive. And sometimes the intuitive is more convincing than the analytical per se. But it depends on the cases. That's why I think it's so important to always practice, as I said earlier, intelligently, by not just repeating, but thinking. And as I like to be my own devil's advocate, I say, but why did he write it like this? Did he intend that? And if he did, why didn't he do it the same way the second time? Sometimes in the recap, it's a different notation for a detail. A triplet is 8th note to 16th. Sometimes you even wonder if a ledger line was forgotten for a harmonization that sounds awkward or banal. Of course, you expect the geniuses you perform to always have ingenious harmonization. Sometimes their great genius is to have simple harmonizations that if it was unfinished, you would never guess by saying, oh, he wouldn't have done this if I had to complete it. Too guessable. They always surprise me, you know. You see at how many levels, in a fantastic way, we can dialogue with the score, with ourselves, in our self-search, in our almost archaeological research, not so much about the facts, which, after all, with comparisons of recordings by so many available online compared to the past, or even more editions that are scrupulous to the original whenever it was, if there was one, or even if there are several. Not to relativity is easy to say, oh, it doesn't matter, Rubinstein recorded Chopin before our text, and so therefore the original text is an objective lure that we seek for, as if we don't want to put ahead our intuitive conviction, not to contradict or in an arrogant way the texts or the search for the composer's intended truth, but to really say, okay, I take it in my arms, in my hands, in my the soulful connection to the piece, and Andante means that to me, the pulse is this to me, and I'll do it this because that's what I'm convinced with, even if later I might change mind. And I find that this is food for thought for an intelligent practicing, not just repetitive practicing. Naturally, this lower tempo practicing is essential, even if, as I mentioned, you have to be very careful to avoid the, in fact, misuse of it, or practicing it with too small gestures if it's too slow, because then you won't have the room to diminish them to get to the tempo when you go. The hold and poke, the rhythm, the articulation, the knuckle, the passing of the thumb under the hand, the flexibility and the strength of grabbing, as well as flexibility of the hand, while the tips of the fingers, like tips of lead, have to enter in the key, even if it's sophisticatedly soft or medium loud, but always precisely, surgically in, and then sculpt with different harmonies or sounds of colorization of voicing. And always think to imagine what is the best disposition to prepare for each articulation, each chord, each carving of a harmonic or melodic pattern. It's not just playing the notes one after the other, it's to feel the energy going through the knuckles. An imaginary bow that goes through your knuckles, that suspended support the fingers that tip enters. And if you repeat a note melodically, you repeat it before it's fully up and deeping down. In other words, your speed of depressing has to go fast, as if you would play loud if you went from above. So you have to control, and you might say, but I'll never have the same piano twice, so it might not respond to me. It might just fire on me if I wanted to do an intense whispered, melodic repeated note. Like syllabic change in song that is translated by the pianist composers to be believable, like a leader, but of course you don't have words or syllables or anything except repeated notes with hammer hitting. But then you imagine it, you're in a denial. Of course I'm not a percussive instrument. In this case, I can sing. And you do without pedal, ta-ha, ta-ha. So finger legato control on repeated melodic notes, a finger legato control on legato step motions or even leaps, sometimes overlapping in order to change the pedal for the harmony without to capture the residue of the preceding harmony. As if you have, and you should have, a melodic legato and a harmonic legato. And since the left hand is often divided in the writing of the composers in the bass line and there's some type of harmonization, it would be patterns of arpeggios, but there is a belonging line, and the melodic line of the bass and the top often sandwich inside the harmonization. Substitutions in order to multiply your fingers' agility and capacity to connect, stretch beyond the of course, evident possibility that the pedal cannot do, because it lifts all the 88 dampers just for one note to connect, and then you don't have any more that whispered specific melodic piano. And you wonder, why should I be playing triple pianissimo after all? If I play in a bigger hall, I have to project and everything has to be louder. And then everything louder becomes more shredded, because the legato at a very loud dynamic is difficult to obtain. The usage of the unicorda to round the sound rather than to soften it compared to the original intent. With the pedal connected with the finger legato for the melodic line allows to have a clear, non-blurred harmonization, regardless if the composer wrote a lot of pedal, because most of the composers of the 19th and 18th century were, of course, naturally playing their instruments, which had separate ranges, color projection, not very well homogenized in its projection. And then they also had shorter decay compared to today's instruments, and the pedal held shorter. So inevitably, if you use the pedals as notated, just because you want to be thorough and honest to the edition on the modern piano, you might get yourself in a blur. You don't want it to be bony nor blurry. You don't want it to be tripletish nor overdotted into grace notishness. You don't want to confuse the departure of upbeat with its own downbeat. Or in the bebunk of the fortepianos. Here it's inside the escapement. Or and spread the articulations towards tenths or even 11ths if the composer wants. You have to be able to accept that delay of the note by articulation of an ornament or in an arpeggio. It doesn't make it better because you have a larger hand. So what? What you have to do is take in account the rhythmically the unmeasured arpeggiation, which delays the real note towards which you're going, that you value by delaying it with the arpeggiation. And then comes the problem, how much do you delay it? Because then your rubato is no more natural because of the gestural stretch. It becomes affected if you over delay it. Trying just to grab it at any price. You realize I cannot grab it. My fifth finger is short when I do a big shifting, so I have then to open my elbow and enter into the note straight arm as if I'm in front of it, as I am in the front of the center of the keyboard with my arms next to my trunk. So grabbing is not a solution. Anticipating and positioning yourself to play it from inside and then shape the touching before you even play it, so that then you project the sound as you really intend, not just the right note at any price as soon as landed, but nano perhaps later time, but touching it brings it a chosen quality of sound besides the right note. And this demultiplication of the left hand playing the arpeggios or the chords and the bass line, which could be played by two hands, and then you have to have still the melody, and sometimes most of the time actually, then sometimes you have stems up and down with melodic line and secondary lines. So you try to multiply, or rather divide your assets to stretch, reach, delay, arpeggiate, pedal, glue the texture, because the range of the piano being so large, most of the composers attempted to cover it all. And that is the symphonic aspect of the piano. Sort of an orchestra of one man or one woman. And it all goes down to the intelligent practicing. Practice the shift. Practice hold and poke for the articulation when the finger lifts after it depressed. Immediately test it with the rhythmic, but for a short sample. To have the crisp articulation of air legato, or if it's indicated, slurred. Legato by connecting, or then if you want a legato that's very warm because you think that is the, but you define it. It's not always clearly indicated when. Overlapping, overgluing. And you have the non-legato. Could be called a wet staccato. Or you have the dry staccato, the comic effect staccato. And then you have the scratch the finger without dropping, without energy of depressing. Something like a pizzicato, which is drier than staccato, or the non-legato air, call it wet staccato. It's almost connected but with space. And then you have the legato. Then you have the very legato. And then you have the super legato. Combined with dynamics, combined with several voices together, like to superimpose layers of voices which cannot be only dynamically brought out or in order to bring this shadow and light chiaroscuro, but also textural contrast between detached and legato. It all depends in which case one wants to have fruitful taste of the piano playing. You can just play simple chords, not a fugue, not a polyphony like in a Renaissance chanson, and still have a voicing, or of course it's easy to get overboard and try to organize creative voicing. And then I think it becomes artificially interesting. He didn't intend that we can guess for sure, but you try to practice so much voicing that you can at some point creatively try to play rather than, but complete in 118.2, Brahms intermezzo. In this way, when you practice, as I did, by self-search really, not because I was asked, how to play voicing everything, chords, fugues, to bring a polyphonic sense of shaping of the texture. Music is sometimes beautifully simple when it's only a melody and accompaniment, and that's also its simple beauty as well as its complex beauty when you play and in a fugue by Beethoven in a sonata, and you go, and you wonder, how can I play trill, repeated staccati 8 notes, and then stretch and this? Did he even think it's playable? Conceptually, as a string quartet writing for piano, through the piano, Beethoven wrote sonatas that will puzzle us forever. Teachers, performers, scholars, and in fact, it remains always to be explored and discovered from different points of view, highlighting, enlightening. When you play the opening of Altstein, without pedal, just finger connection, or you play staccato with pedal, and with una corda for softer, or you do it all by fingers. Who chooses why, what, when? You. Who decides why, what, when, stylistically and true to the text? You. How do you manage to have these opinions? Well, of course, you listen to others, you read many editions, you get super informed, you spend time studying by trying different amount of ritenuti with the rhythmic ritenuto and without, or on top of it, because you cannot not add more feeling to the... And then... and you say, oh, of course, I don't want to add more to it. In other words, the craftsmanship is to play exactly what is intended by the notation. And then if I do that, by all honesty, in the best sense of the word, then it's going to happen. In other words, I'm not recomposing the piece artistically. I'm not reinventing the phrase directions, the voicings, the shapings of the articulations. I observe them. If it's by 2, and if it's by 4, and I will shape it in a dynamic that I think corresponds according to my piano, according to the style in which I'm playing. If a mezzo piano is not the same Haydn than in Beethoven or in Schumann. But all that is because I, at the beginning, have the flame that animates me to search for it. I want to play the best because it means to me so much. This piece is so beautiful, even if I'm spending my life until I get to play it right, defining by my standards, perhaps unreachable for my technique until I rise my technique to the standards of my musical expectation or my teacher's expectation or my desire to emulate a fast tempo or practice only first the exercises like for the etudes until I get to play and then shape and be in control of what I want. If I want a half legato, half dynamic, or with rubato. And of course, pianos respond differently. That is true. So you've put yourself in jeopardy, but by the time you impose your will on the keyboard, you play from close up, you shape, you articulate, you don't do gestures that are unnecessary by practicing slowly under tempo, proportional gestures, 5 minutes breaks, not to get tendons over tense, especially if you have precision octaves that you connect only by the arm and therefore through the tension of the tendons, and then you practice the fingers and then the wrists. And then the combination of the two, like a bird landing, so you can have a flexibility to rebound and precision of the imprint without to have to do with the whole arm, hand, and stiffness, which not only can, of course, very dangerously create a tendinitis ultimately, but also changes the quality of the sound on top of it. You'll say, oh, he's banging or she's banging. Well, you didn't intend to, just to keep it clean. So to be audacious, to dare to get to the point when you raise the level of your technique in order to detailedly play what you think the piece is supposed to be, because this means to you. And it meant to you when you couldn't play it because you loved the piece, and then you try to rise from different points of view to the tip of the mountain, which would represent the what you consider perfect interpretation. That doesn't have to do only with the cleanness, because that is the dictatorship of the wrong note. Of course, the aim of being astutely precise, anticipatedly organized, shifting, anticipate, touching, shaping the sound, but the precision as well, avoiding black keys or fingerings that allow to not just trip into unwillingly some note that speaks when you prepare and not to hear. Of course, you try to learn to avoid obstacles. You try different fingerings, or you advise different fingerings. You try to figure out. You practice your substitutions to multiply your finger legato finger pedal compared to only the necessity of the pedal, unless it's not possible. And then you reach the point where you think, oh, I think I know how I would like it to be. And then you see, when will I be able to play it? And on which piano and when? And what if I have stage fright? What if the instrument doesn't respond? What if I am too nervous? What if I have a memory slip? In other words, the unbelievable vulnerability of being, while the will is strong, the being is vulnerable. The aim is intact, even if the obstacles are enormous. The time it takes. Why didn't I already play like this practicing of the ballades, number 4 by Chopin, third, and you practice it and you do rhythms, and you try again, and you adjust the wrist and the arm for the black to white sliding, white to black keys because of the height rising. Anticipate the gesture so you have the fingers exactly aligned. Okay, all this is right. It's a detailed practice of a section, analyze the gesture, the piano technique for it, and then when you play it in the context, you mess it up. Not you, one messes it up. And that's where is experienced, having messed up myself, of course, like all of us, we gain the wisdom of knowing that a certain fingering allows to do it better in a certain configuration, but not all hands fingerings work. For some anatomies of students are different from ours, obviously, if not all. But for some, the advised fingering works. For some, the teacher has to come up with another fingering that might work better. And of course, the student's supposed to also try to come up with a fingering. And they do. But sometimes the wisdom is from the experience, right? And so then you think, how long will it take to me between the wise practice with a knowledgeable technique towards the musical addressing gesture of the composer with a correctly understood text, well memorized, revisited several times until it settles in, so we can make the transitions merge in traffic and not oversaw when you ritenuto under the tempo, then you restart. In other words, when you listen to it, it has to sound simple and natural, like it is for ballet when they suffer, but they appear not to on presentation. And same thing with you. It should sound like as if you're on the spot, appearing to be intuitively improvising it when you play scrupulously the notes. So that's not about sounding random or sounded learned or sounding pompous or sounding. It has to sound what you think the piece is, not more. If you add too much of your expression with more ritenuto and accelerando than the rhythmic aspect of it already intended in the notation. If you want to extra, yes, but when? If it's a craftsmanship or artistry. Do you add to the craftsmanship artistic ways by saying, I'm going to make Beethoven or Bach or Chopin or Schumann or Schubert or Mozart or Debussy or Fauré or Ravel or whoever you serve through actually their music more than themselves, because you try to inhale the unbelievably unforgettable and seemingly also ephemeral perfume of the atmosphere that their music creates. Or dynamics, emotions, notational, read, understood, memorized renderings with stylistic differences, where you decide and you define your soundscape. Then you can be always and should be, as a conductor, beating the beat before the orchestra to pull them towards what he or she wants to do. You have to always anticipate so that you're prepared, prepositioned for and then if not, you have to prepare the gesture. And it's always the brain thinking ahead, the gesture anticipated, prepared, so that you can optimally play the section according to what you wish to do, or hope to do, or intend to do. And of course, then is the unexpected of the once through the piece public performance, where the unintended, the unexpected always happens. And then you have to deal with it in real time as if you planned it when you spent so many weeks, months, and nights and days, depending on how much and how long and how often you practiced that section. And you go through these nuanced dynamic changes, nuanced tempo changes. You want to obtain this very linear progression of tempo compared to just switch at once. And all what you planned all of a sudden doesn't happen in real time, and you feel almost disarmed, and you say, oh my God, all this for that? All this practicing for just not going through like planned, like rehearsed, like repeated? We hear, rehearse, repeat. Art, artificial life. So it's until it sounds naturally performed, as if improvised, while totally artificially prepared, in order to have all the ingredients of the composer's genius for the balances of everything, the structure, the texture, the everything is there for a purpose, in order to create that sense that gives us the satisfaction that the artwork talks to our souls through its psychological language, perhaps universal, if we call it for music language. And yet again, the more you work on this, the more you realize that you can most of the time not render it to your desire when you perform it the one time through in public. And it's a good thing it's one time through, because then the piece really takes its meaning. It's like living a lifetime. Of course, you can retake takes and make it artificially as a lifetime, like in films. And you can also do the same thing in recording sessions for audio CDs. But ultimately, that's not important, even if you can, or you could, or you should, or it's perhaps more practical, and it's less tiring, and it's less emotionally draining, and it's less intellectually draining. Is the concentration that it demands is to be so detailedly controlling and so free at the same time for the macro, so that you can float on the piece with all the details in place, controlled by yourself. And then if it's too controlled, it's robotized. If it's not controlled enough, it's messy, it's unreliable, and then all of a sudden in the middle of something beautiful, a note sticks out and you go, oh, but the piano, can't blame it. But even if you do, what's the difference? It's happened. It always happens once, and once you've managed it the best you could, the next time you play, it's from scratch all the way up. It's like as if a painter has to repaint a painting that vanishes as soon as painted. Don't tell painters that, they wouldn't accept that. But that's when, at the ephemeral moment, the beauty, the piece reveals itself to you like an imaginary construction that is more beautiful than you think, and you have combinations of harmony, melody, repeated notes, pedal, pace more than tempo, pulse more than rhythm. constantly morphing itself in metamorphosis, is exactly what I thought. Yes, you can play Scarlatti and Rachmaninoff, Tchaikovsky and Chopin, Beethoven symphony, or Tchaikovsky opera on the piano, as well as Haydn sonata written for the piano, or music even from before the piano obviously was invented, but I speak keyboard wise, like lute time music, and you realize that the instrument is so universal that it's easy to make all sound like alike, while if you want to not, you have to apply your imagination to project the difference between something medieval and something perhaps impressionistic, or something more factual, or something mystical. Or something silly. Than any of the composers whom you play from the past, the different time periods of theirs, because you can play them all on the same instrument. Well, how and with which means and how you define and all that is what I was meaning earlier, but you can. And you think Schubert couldn't have played Bartók. Of course, that's simply obvious and kind of childish to mention, but it is a fact that your ear has heard dissonances that are not functional for consonances that are not sweet, majors that are minors that end with major, that minor second themes come back in the same or different, and then they have relative majors for minors, and you have all kinds of altered degrees for the tonal system to add some kind of color from the leading tone to the Neapolitan second flat degree, or all these ingredients that for each composer become in effect a tool, a mean, a way of expressing who they are, what they want to say, and what they believe in. But you can, on the same piano, in the same recital, cover several centuries of different intents of musical expression by people who had no idea about each other, but you put them together in your recital. It's like this beautiful bouquet of flowers where the flowers grew up separately and you put them together by your choice, and you say, see, I think this harmony of colors, of shapes, of smells combined represents what I would like to present to my audience. Of course, you can always play the complete of one single composer, in which case it's just all roses or all whatever. But I think still, even within the composer, you have so many different styles. Sometimes their pieces sound so different from each other, from earlier to later in the development of their own musical expression or language. Even if they mostly used commonly a tonal system to express themselves. I think it's a fantastic time to play so many things, but the way they were intended according to what we think, not just because of the instruments. Of course, our choice is to play them on the original instruments, and that's marvelous. But if we still want, in parallel, instead of opposing it, which I don't, play them on the modern instrument, then you have to find a way to translate, like they say, translation, interpretation. Interpreting is interpretation, is translation. Cannot translate a poem because the music of the words is also in the sounds of the original language, not just the meaning. So do you just listen to sounds for sounds? Like, for instance, the first of Brahms 119. You feel like stars falling, or drops. And all of a sudden, and you all of a a sudden have some kind of organization of civilization. And here he thought it was just unrelated sounds. Okay, it doesn't go as far. And so you don't know if there is a meaning to it, or is it just the beauty of the moment for what it is, epidermic or just atmospheric. And then after that, he, of course, he defines B minor. So all of a sudden you say, oh yeah, I understand it's B minor. So you start putting a meaning to what that was. You make it explicit, but you don't want it to be explicit. You want it to be as he intended it, to be an opening that is puzzling, bewildering, like, oh, how beautiful, what is it? And sometimes when you analyze too much, you know so much the meaning of things that perhaps you forget the beauty of the sounds for the sounds, not just for the meaning. When you hear the meaning, you forget the sounds. So we can combine both. Of course, when you translate a poem, then inevitably you use different sounds because the languages are different. So you translate a meaning, not the sounds of the original text. So you have to learn Russian to read Chekhov, and then Spanish to read Cervantes. And of course, that would be ideal. And so you can spend a whole life learning the language of this composer and that composer. And then you'll say, with the repertoire and my desire and necessity and obligation or jobs, I have to learn so much, but so much, I'll never have time. So what I just do is recite the notes, is print it, and I'll put some guidelines between the indications of the score and the teacher and the recordings, and I'll come up with something. But we yearn for more. We're not always satisfied with a short-term necessity because it's an exam date, a release date of a concert, a recording, or a performance. And after all, if it's a competition and something, a deadline is motivational. Because if not, it's an open-ended search about what is a texture of string quartet translate on piano in a Beethoven sonata. And not only theoretically, but really pianistically. What is the staccato, comic or anxious, or dry or wetter, crescendo or just equal? That's more craftsmanship, this is more artistic. And what if I devaluate myself and say, I'm nobody, Beethoven is everything? What if I think right now, while I played, I am in charge and I want to be as responsible, to be honest, to the composer, as creative to play for my audience what it means to me? It's a subtle balance. Sometimes, sometimes. So you could articulate eventually then different each of the notes and the crescendo. And let's say, for the sake of the caricatural display of this example, the rubato. People say, is he or is she crazy? Or is the teacher out of mind? Or is too romantic if Bach is rubato? Is too strict if Chopin is not? But how much you get out of the role to comparably stay on the track, and what is appropriate, what is not, what is good taste, what is bad taste, who defines it, which time period, which recordings influence us, who's the pianist we want to emulate, who we admire and we want to imitate. Emulate, imitate, study, learn, appropriate, interpret, translate. I find all this fascinating because in many aspects it's all of the above, and all of a sudden during the time of a performance, after the many repeated times of practicing it, you have one chance to go through that path and give the illusion that you're improvising it, or perhaps that you're just displaying it apparently as naturally as the composer inspiredly wrote it, if not perhaps after many sketches as well. Artificial nature of things. Mozart said supposedly that he always improvised and composed and did his first throws in his mind. He didn't have to write a sketch. Chopin said, my left hand ignores what my right hand does. Schumann said, I want to play like as if I hear myself without to play. Fine, great, perfect. What do I do with that? Okay, those are, giants, and I am nothing, and they are all that, and I want to serve them, I want to play their music. Not so much serve them, perhaps that is not the primary inspiration or drive or yearning or necessity to go through all this tedious practicing and learning and years of schooling and lessons and discipline and counting and metronomizing one's own pulse inside ourselves, because it's not just from outside in, it has to come from inside out once it's all filtered and understood. And after 2 or 3 revisitations of the piece, then you start playing it more like as if it's yours. Not only the memorization, but also the way you connect the transition, and you realize that when you play the 16th notes or in triplets, it's not just only busier, it's also repeated notes. And you can do it without the pedal, because with the pedal they bubble, and then they overlap the length of sound of the decay. The 2 even melodies, and then you have to pick up the held notes following shorter or next note at the level of its decay. But then what do you do with the next one? If you always pick it lower, so you have to pull it up, and then imagine that these are your vibrato. And factual to play everything nominal, mezzo forte detached for security, all notes play on all pianos, and then we just put right foot pedal for legato and left pedal for dynamics, rather than do it all first at most from the fingers, control, shape, organize, voice, articulate, sculpt without pedal in this case, and then add the pedal only for perhaps an extra fragrance brush. If you cannot, then you have to delay because it's too stretched. But by delaying before the beat, on the beat, and what do you do with the ornaments like the mordents in the second theme of the first movement before the beat, on the beat. Us we should be doing it on the beat, in romantic before the beat, because it's into the melodic line. Whenever in the embellishment it's over the melodic line, it's a mordent coming from, is issuing rather from an appoggiatura, or originally repeated in Monteverdi's operas. The trillo was the note that was mentioned by repeating it, and then of course the action of the instruments and the technique doesn't always allow, so you take the neighboring tone that you bite, mordre, mordent, mordar, which means obviously bite, and if you bite twice, 3 times in a row, then it becomes a trill. So you started from the upper note on the beat, but who's to say you have to do that inside the Beethoven, Chopin, Schumann piece? If we go, in the fantasy, this crescendo, this trill is really a vibrato. An embellishment, measured or not. Concerto, the trills are there, is romantic era, late into it, and they still write dynamics, but mostly ornamentation, notation that is Baroque. So do they embellish? Do they enhance dramatically, imitating operatic effects of the bel canto and further of the opera vivismo? I speak to you loud voice, things that I constantly think about when I try to serve honestly the music at its best. Of course, when I teach, I try to give all these aspects to the students, knowing that by repeating week after week, some of the aspects will stick because I'm aware that the bag is overflowing of elements to control, to think, to remember, let less to master and control or pretend to control on instruments that anyway change every time you play on, because it's never twice the same piano, but you should play the flute. Obviously, the point is that I think about it, I yearn towards it when I play myself. When I teach, I try to be more objective. When I play, I just try to be more subjective because it's my moment to express it. And of course, when I teach it, I try to give it in perspective so that I can teach the students not to play it like I like it. Well, partly too, to be honest, but also how I understand it, or how I understand it should be understood or thought of, and therefore give them more of a lock-in kit to build their own door, rather than give them the key of my lock and say do like me, because inevitably the tips of the icebergs don't reveal exactly the construction of the icebergs under the water, for another analogy of mine, whatever the sake of it is. But the point is that we tend to want to learn by imitation, which is fine too. We do that since birth as babies with our primary tongue, the mother tongue. We do that because we imitate by ear. We try to, it means to us, we want to imitate it, and then we learn it by the text, and then the text gives us the other amount of information and carries as well its part of disinformation. Or plethora of texts also confuse even more. Then you have to trust a teacher, trust a publisher, trust trust. Who do you trust? Perhaps most of the time you don't trust yourself. You have to start becoming not arrogantly full of yourself, because you still too, of course, that's not the point. But you have to have a certain level of reaching a point where you say, well, that's what I want to do, that's what I want to try to do, and I'll think about it differently for later. Because it's easy to say, I don't like this piece, I love this piece. Perhaps I don't like it because I don't understand it. Perhaps I'll understand it better. In order to understand the piece, perhaps I will go through other pieces of other composers, which will nourish me, my comprehending the piece that I seem to either dislike it or not be able to understand how to play, regardless if there are other models that are there for me to inspire me or to want to imitate. And when I think about all these aspects on my own and share with you as I do today, is that they all go down the drain at the moment of the single performance, which is supposed to integrate all of the nutrients of these elements, the mental, the visual, the obviously listening, combined with the fingertips response of the sensorial approach of the depth of the keyboard's action, and then how you project your intended inner ear hearing of the piece, and how it matches or not matches at the moment of performance what you produce or what you think you project, because that's another level of problems, that in the hall with the acoustics they hear it differently than you on stage. If you feel it's not enough sound, you force, and then all of a sudden, like a domino effect, your articulation doesn't follow, your hand doesn't support. If you put too much weight, a heavy iron on your hands, and you collapse and you have a wrong note, or because you, in other words, it's not just pushing buttons in the right order. Well, ultimately it appears to be, and it is, but it's also a way to alternatively respond on the spot to the unexpected of the performance, and then find another way through the maze of the garden that you know and you observe from above while walking inside it and rediscovering it, perhaps faking as an actor to rediscover it every time, because obviously at some point you repeat yourself even in performance, and it reassures you until the moment where something collapses, memory slip, articulation problem, finger went to the wrong place but you didn't control. Whichever reason, you don't have time to analyze, it's instantaneous like an accident, and you have to react. And at this point you have to know strategically or with cool head, where am I in the piece? If you know harmonically the progression, you know where the cadence is, you know toward which tonality you go. Of Of course, if you're solo without orchestra, it's easier to turn around and improvise until you find your way out, instead of stopping and surrendering to the fact that beyond perhaps finger memory, you cannot connect the dots until the time you can have several layers of knowledge of the piece that in fact nourish each other and therefore allow you to be less vulnerable to that glitch, whichever source of it is on the spot, and then make up as if you intended it, which is even harder because then you have to react in real time, not to give the impression that you're embarrassed by your mistake, which is so self-evident to perhaps less to the non-connoisseurs than the connoisseurs. But regardless, you don't play just for a category of people or others. You play for your own yearning to play the piece at what you think is best. Perhaps you compete with others who played best, or compete with yourself to play the best. But even if in the audience they are aware, half aware, totally not aware, not everybody has perfect pitch in the audience, it could happen that they don't catch it. Many conductors don't hear everything going on when they conduct, imagine. So it's just to say that you should not be always, as a performer, stressed, oh my God, it's too late, it's shame, and may the earth open under me and I just disappear because I mistreated the piece. There is nobody died. It's not an accident, thank God, like in cars or planes. But the capacity to realize all that in a split nano moment and make sense of it and change entirely your phrasing because you unintendedly made an accent where the note came out louder than you pretended, you hoped, you wished it to be the contrary. Then you have to play the next note a bit louder too, and then follow to the next end of sentence and make it as if you intended to say it so, rather to intended to say it so. Because on the moment, something happens. That's the beauty of the performance when it's not all controlled. It's not about, but it is a lot about concentration, and then the capacity of your practicing to give you enough muscular memory to go through sections, but not for too long without controlling and being ahead of them thinking wise. That's why I was saying when you practice, not just about repeat, it's about attentive concentration. So you learn while you play how you control yourself, the structure, the topography of the keyboard, because in one tonality is different from the other. And you start analyzing every detail of the section, how you present the finger, how you avoid another key that you have to avoid the obstacle, how you connect the note, how you make the dynamics range, etc. And when some of the elements cannot be produced and it's the one time through, then all of a sudden you have to accept that it's not going to happen like you wished it, regardless if that was good to be or not, but okay, it's no more. So you have to deal with the unexpected as if it was planned. How all these words are so easy to say. But in fact, while it's a lifetime of struggle for a few seconds of bliss, it's worth it. Because you prove yourself something. It's like carving for a sculptor, organizing colors or perspectives for a painter, or lack of, regardless. Is whatever it is that the art that you use to translate the analogy of life's psychological essence of hope, love, despair, anger, boredom, whatever you want. All this is in the music. Music is a language. It's not, but it also tells it its own way. Even if you try to find the, and it is often the case through the titles of the pieces or through the mood of the pieces, you realize very well what it's supposed to intend. So, but it tells it in its own way. Oh, it's tenderness, oh, it's anger, oh, it's pathos, oh, it's daydream. And you imagine scenarios that are without words, or poems that are without specific language. Just the essence of it, like you enter, like Scriabin very often doesn't even take the context in which to prepare you to understand what happens. He shocks you emotionally, sensorially, all the senses, and all of a sudden you have to not even make sense of it, because it's not the point to make sense of it, or Berg. You're immediately thrown into a ecosystem, universe. You don't know, you don't understand, and you don't have to. You just react sensorially to it, emotionally to it, psychologically to it, or something like. Of course, the more you dissect it in studying, you start learning the elements. It's like, yes, and then you put it back together as a craftsman, but then artistically it has its own soul, anima. It's not just the notes, it's not just the correct compared to the wrong, it's not the right compared to the mistaken. It's beyond and above. It's the meant and the connected and the elevated and the spiritual connection, where all of a sudden you play a fugue and you realize that you wonder about the essential questions of finitude. And it's all there. Where do I go? How do I come back? And it's a vicious circle. It's no solution. Then Brahms will give you the key of it. But no, it's a yearning, it's a searching, and you realize, how do I translate that unsettlement? First, by doing the correct rhythms and the correct notes and the correct pedaling and the correct tempo, or if not correct, at least the attempted tempo. Well, but then the point of it is not it's just not the messenger, it's the message. And you have to play with the message, one, like as if you are, another analogy, horseman and the horse, the intent and the intention, and you become the hyphen between the two. The conductor of the orchestra, the performer of the piece. The piece is you, you are the piece. The instrument and you are together into exploring the soundscapes of the piece for the audience, but for you it's not exploring because you rehearsed them, repeated them. And it's very important to practice like that. To practice slowly, yes, because of course when you practice slowly, the whole psychological, emotional, driven message, narrative, storytelling of the piece disappears. You just work on details, how to shape, and then not which articulation, which dynamic. How does insert that into the structure, not just syllabic, but into a sentence, into a paragraph, into a structure, and then micro. I constantly try to bring these elements to my students to practically on the score. And if the composer chooses not to do what I, in the example, say, okay, the answer is there, but it's a deferred answer because it doesn't come right away at leading tone, you see? And so then you have to understand how to organize the repeated notes. Is it equal ta-ta-ta, ta-ha-ta, ta-ha-ta? Is it a syllable? Is it a sung or a carried vowel? Restrict the area of what you want to obtain, you realize that then if you want a legato by the finger, fast but soft, dynamically and not rushed, and then with the unicorda, perhaps you won't won't find, but on a specific piano, specific acoustic, with specific moment of your day, with specific inspiration and specific practiced exercises, the idealization for each section. Of course, that would be ideal, but it's unpractical. It's not real. You have to make with what you have. And some people, no matter how much detail they practice, when it comes to the performance, it's messed up, and then you get depressed and disappointed with yourself, and you give up, and you think, I'll never be good enough. It's past age for competition, past age for studies, and now what? Should I all give it up? It still means to me more than anything else. And if it does, then I will pursue. And I'll open to different repertoires. And I'll open to more developed understanding of the one repertoire that still bugs me until I get it. Perhaps I won't, but perhaps I will. And if I do, I will go further and deeper, because perhaps I didn't dig enough, even if my teacher might say I scratched the surface and I thought I already went all the way down. I have no more fingers. No, yes, you have to go further because you haven't yet reached the truth of it. And for some point, at some moment that is unrelated to when you studied, when you learned it, when you memorized it, when you perform it, when you won with it, or when you lost with it, a competition, a job, an example, exercise, whatever it is, comes a moment where all of a sudden it all comes in one. It blends into one. The tempo, the articulation, the feeling, the atmosphere, the piano, the acoustic, and you feel like you're in it. Oh, that's it. That's what I wanted. Not the too much, not the under, not this craftsman or the artistic, because they want too much, they want not enough. And who am I, and who is it, and what it is for me, and when will I have finally ever try to? Will I ever play it clean? Will I ever play it right? Will I ever play it artistically as I want? Will I ever stylistically play it as I want? Can I do the articulation for the legato and and the repertoire is vast, and the styles are different, and the composers themselves change styles. The more I spin like a washer all the facts in the spinning washer, the more when it comes out, it's supposed to be finally all fluid, natural, as if effortless, not to mention without disappointments, without self-disappointments, without false hopes, false joys. And I misguessed all my life a note, and I always thought it was the right note, and I recorded it, and now it's there, and I'll never be able to see myself in the mirror, because I'll be like, how come I forgot? Where is it? Oh, how come on? And why did the edition not have a courtesy accidental to, because my intuitive reading, but I thought, but in fact, and how come nobody told me? But in fact, I should have. I'm giving you here a little bit of a shortcut of some disappointments with yourself about misread, misguessed notes, as I like to say. Sometimes as a teacher, I find this misguessed notes to be a beautiful revealing factor of the level of intuitive musicianship of a student who cannot not do something even if it's in front of his or her eyes. Of course, objectively, when you sit next side to the student, and you see, and you say, then it's a denial. But I liked it better my way. Really? Oh, how come I didn't notice it? And I never heard it without the recording. Does everybody does that? And then comes the acceptance. Oh, of course it's better, naturally. Then I could say, but why? After all, it's an exercised fact. After all, if everybody does it, it's right. But if it by any chance was written with a different alteration, we would like it as well for that too. So we're all having to be humble in front of our intuition that we need to keep as a flame, even if it manages sometimes to bring us to misread, misguess. But sometimes we do it with such honesty that you're so disappointed. It breaks my heart when I teach rather, a piece that a student studied, and I have to reveal them that they misread a note that they play with such conviction that it means to them the piece as well, the macro and the micro, and take it out of it, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, but it's at many levels, is disappointment with oneself. How come I didn't see it? How come I didn't read it? But then it's also, but I liked it better that way, until you accept it and you play it his or her way. But it happens to yourself, and it's in a recording and you cannot change it. Then you're even more ashamed, even as an older, supposed to be experienced. Sometimes the scores have ways to look at you, laugh at you, and they go, ha, you thought you know me, huh? I still have something to reveal to you. And you wonder, okay, I know, and I have to play this. And all of a sudden, while you play, you hear something you never heard before, the rapport of the rest with the music. The rest is a sound. If it's a non-sound, like a black hole, it's enrobing the sound. It's not just a cut. It's a silent bridge, as if it was. So if you delusionally start hearing the rest as some kind of imaginary sound they dreamt, I think it's delusional. So you have to hear it for the beauty of what it is, the emptiness of it, which is sound in the sense of intensity of the pregnant rest, if I may say so, as musicians have to say sometimes, when then you enhance it rather than just metronomically. And so how do you practice rests? How do you practice to organize a phrasing with a breath where it's no breathing because the instrument doesn't call for, but the musical sentence does? And is it always by groups of 4 and 2 and 6 and 8 or 10 or 12? And you have to plan it. After all, you're not just the conductor and them the performers, you are both. Sometimes you just follow your fingers, say, I don't care, I just play. But if you're a conductor, you have to prepare the upbeat, you have to organize a downbeat, you have to give the intention for this, prepare the accent of that, anticipate this, call this musician, prepare this, plan everything, basically run a traffic jam, and hopefully make it fluid. But all this is, I think, the fascination that I have with the capacity of a piece to reveal itself to you, either because you're experienced and you are old and you've gone through it and it still reveals itself differently, or if not different aspects of it. It's a gift that keeps on giving. And then how to organize and give the tools for the student to open their horizon so they can experience it on their own and find their own grail that is not yours as a teacher and is not per se the one of the person they try to imitate on the recording they admire. And that doesn't happen, unfortunately, within the learning time with the students. So you harvest the garden, and then the flowers and the fruits and the vegetables appear way after you've taught your students. It's a deferred, very deferred blossoming. But on the way, as the philosophers say, the aim of the trip is the trip itself. So you enjoy harvesting. Not cloning. Giving food for thoughts. Connecting always the emotional, the inspirational, the intuitive with the knowledgeable. Try to find a balance, not to become too much of the one versus not enough of the other. You always think you miss something. You need more technique, you need more understanding, you need less stage fright, more memorization capacity at different levels, not just the ear or also the eye, but also the structure and the harmony, and the structure if there is a harmony. Say tonal is even harder. But all these things you always want to acquire. I want to have better trills, more independence of fingers. Inevitably, I have to practice slowly. The fingers that have like 5 and 4 1 tendon, and then try to organize independence. Theoretically, on practicing exercises independently on the structural section of the piece itself. And that's why all this goes back to practice intelligently. You have to have patience, discipline, repetitivity, constant concentration. Take breaks for your hands, because you can pull yourself beyond your capacity by your eventually strong concentration, and your arms cannot follow if you repetitively practice. Holding tight from the arms the precision of the imprint of the chords, and then but it's always not clean, so you repeat and you repeat and you repeat, and because you're obviously concentration and willpower combined with discipline, you can push yourself further than your physical can take. So you have to take breaks, go back to exercises, go sections, go exercises, go into the piece, breathe, take again, listen, record yourself to observe if you managed to play it or not, or you thought you did. So it demands enormous amount of courage. And that's the word that I think is the most important: relentlessness and courage. Humility to accept that even if you managed it once, somehow, after a lot of repetitivity, it's not locked in somewhere in your mnemotechnic system. It's going to happen differently every time you'll play it. So the guarantee isn't that because you practice it and you age with it that you get more and more to lock all the bolts, and then the piece will just be like you wish it every time. First, it'll be boring, if it were, but it's never going to be the case. It always reveals itself differently by minute details, but they are a combination of them. You rediscover the garden, the maze. You know it, but you have the plans, you memorized it, you can visualize it, but then while you're walking there, a smell, an attention, a color, something attracts your attention, and all of a sudden you rediscover the piece reveals itself to you differently, even if you locked all the elements that you thought you controlled by the technique and the analysis and the practicing and the listening and the performing and the testing it in front of friends and people and audience and friends, and then finally jury, exam, audition, whatever it is, recital, concert, recording session. Every aspect of the piece, you chew it, you taste it, you cook it, you restart it, you recook it, you try again, you try this ingredient, this legato, this articulation, this dynamic, this tempo, this accelerando, this less of that, more of this section, no, I liked it this better, like time, but last time I did well is because this section went like that, and then doesn't say that it's supposed to be this section faster. So do I have the right to or not, and how much, and what are the tectonic plates of the tempi? Rapports of tempi, is it 2-1, is it the third, is it the triplet? How do I go from triplets to 8th notes or 16th notes by 4 without to appear to do it mechanically or robotically, but in a fluid way? Is it intended to be fluid? It all goes back down to that practicing day where you have to have courage, that's the word, to persevere, to not give up. And I think that people who know that practicing the piano is more difficult than playing it. Learning a piece is exhilarating. Practicing it can become tediously boring, or if not boring, discouraging, as if you spoon feed an ocean with a teaspoon, and you feel like by the time I manage to organize and control ideally every detail in each bar, it will take me a month a bar, and if there are thousands of bars, then I give up. That's where the courage comes in, and I always like to say to the students, that's what you are. You're somehow the horsemen or the champions or the warriors aesthetic war, of the war to better yourself, to bring the beauty at most purest to the audience. You're the sculptors, you're the shapers, you're the painters, you're the storytellers, you're the narrators. Of course, you narrate words of others, you narrate phrases of others, and pitches of others, and rhythms of others, and you, in the repetitivity of the practicing, your intimacy with the piece becomes such that you, of course, think it's you. You don't think it's you who made it up. The audience does sometimes. And that's good, because it's like an actor who becomes the character and who is the character. And you don't have that rupture of disbelief anymore, because you know it's an actor who's telling a story or acting the story. And it's overplayed, it's unnatural, it's underacted, it's just not captivating enough. And you over-captivate, then you don't play the meaning of the piece. The piece is not there to be surlined with fluo highlighters by your interpretation. It's supposed to happen by the beauty of its own choices of the composer's modulations, change of ranges, different colorizations of the way the piece resonates in the composer's inner ears, as if retrieving from some forgotten, beautiful atmosphere, moment of life, that reminiscence comes back like an old memory. And then it becomes separate from the composer because it's notated, regardless how detailedly, but it is. And then it travels through time like a bottle with a message in the ocean, as they used to do. And you receive it, and of course now you have the opportunity to compare it to other people, how they read that same text. But once you get to it, it becomes a personal interaction with the piece, as if all the others have never seen it, as if it's the only connection, you and the piece now, regardless how others faced it. The text was there before us, it'll be there after us, and for each of us, it's an intimate encounter. It's my encounter with the appassionata. Is it a grace note? Is it a 16th note articulated? Is it just a sliding, almost glissando? Is it a diminuendo? Is it a dominant tonic, or does it not matter? Could it have been more intriguing if it were a diminished fifth rather than a perfect fifth with a minor third, which is less intriguing, but it is intriguing opening. And now I know why he didn't do it. It would have been perhaps too much of the spooky feeling, but here you have a spooky feeling, perhaps if it is, or mourning, or expecting, or just in suspension, in expectation of something to happen, with a simple minor triad rather than a diminished one, which would be triggering psychologically more that. So you see, you have to dosage what it means, how much it means. You think to the piece, to the composer, to you, to the performer, and how you dosage all these elements to become filtered, funneled through your psyche, and not, let's say, diminished by your psyche, but you elevate yourself towards the piece rather than shrink it towards you, if I may say so, in an aesthetic and spiritual way of elevation. We become better because we carved shape it. And then of course you can decide after some time, perhaps you revisit this piece in a year or two, in 3, I don't know, 10, you record it, you teach it, you you write an article, a book about it, who knows, whatever, but it is there with you. It's like a companion in life, and the more you know about it, the least you think you can ever know about it, because it seems to have so much to reveal, even if you try first to define it more simply in order to play it right, as the students like to say, compared to wrong. Then you develop your own truth rather than just imitate the one of the other. Admired or ordained truth is truth, and it's temporary truth, and then you can very well, few years later, or perhaps even months later, decide that when you listen to your recording, say, oh really, why did I do that? Now if I play it, I would just go directly for this because it's more meaningful than to go for this. But it was still very meaningful then. I don't think you should reject. There is no wrong way of loving. Is perhaps aesthetically, in the performance practice knowledge, in the analytical understanding of the piece, in the educated knowledge about how people perform this kind of sections in this kind of period, in this kind of instruments for this time of that. But still, once you go through all this, which is essentially important if you have the courage and the time and the money to spend for it, because it's a lot of all of that, without to lose courage in the middle of it, to always repaint the canvas from scratch, musically. Then only I think you can realize that you can relativize and say, okay, well, it's not bad, but if I play today, it wouldn't be like that. And so you try it again, and then perhaps later again. Perhaps there will never be a moment where you'll say, well, that's the best I can do with it. First, because you don't want to accept that for yourself. And second, because the more you give time and discipline and patience and relentless practicing, the more you do, the more you want to prove to yourself more than to the audience or the jurors or the job givers, at whichever level you use this piece for different moments of accounting for your scholarship or your industry. And you have to be accepted by your peers to be the teacher or to be the winner of the competition or to be the writer of the scholar of the knowledge of the piece that others will learn from, perhaps textbook about it if you write. But it is always the piece itself that keeps revealing itself time and time again. I find that fascinating and humbling, so humbling. In fact, the fun is to play even wrongly. But to practice is sometimes so difficult, because most of the time, unlike your string quartet player or wind quintet performer, you experience the betterment of your trade by the obligational fact to combine with the others your musical voice to theirs. Even if you practice separately to prepare for it, but most of the rehearsals happen with them. And so on the piano, you practice most of the time by yourself, if not most, all the time. So you have to be your judge, your inspirer, your courage giver, and your relentless critic. Nobody can do that easily by themselves. It's not given. It's in anything in life, let less in practicing piano. But it's part of the character building of a young artist student, is the quality of their practicing. We never attend the practicing, like recording artists, for instance, conductors attend rehearsals of recording sessions of other conductors. So they attend the making of. But the making of in solo piano is always behind doors. On not great instruments, in not great acoustics, to say the least, most of the time on dreadful on both accounts. And then you dream of the great sound, you dream of the performance, you dream of your technique allowing you this, you dream not to get stiff, not to get tired, not to get in the wrong note, to avoid this, to avoid that, to prepare this, to reach that, to shape this, to sing that, to pedal this, to colorize that, and all combined. It's almost like as if a recipe told on the TV and you try to put all the ingredients and then it doesn't taste like what they supposedly say it will, because there is always a little something in the balance of the ingredients that makes the whole difference, that you might have overlooked or not enough practiced, and you have to go back to nucleus detail and say, okay, I'm going to still practice. And I've been not to be disappointed and not to be discouraged if I have to go back to the detail, even if I already played the piece, because perhaps that's where the weakness of this finger connected to that, because of this fingering, because of this disposition of the keyboard, etc. And then it can unlock a problem, and then you become more confident, and you finally realize that you don't have to be worried about this section anymore, because somehow you found a way um, to to control it more than it controls you. Of course, unfortunately, because of the events and the elements, you're more controlled by the instrument and your emotions and your stage fright and your muscular, or let's say visual memory, whichever things control you, and you try to arrive on stage and all ready and all pumped up and all practiced and all want to go just to the finish line, like a athlete who practiced exactly which step goes where on which track on the track, on field and track, and you've practiced the fingering, the articulation, all the exercises that they're available, or you think, but they're always more. And as a teacher, I'm here to help students find ways to vanquish those vulnerabilities, so that they become more reliable. And if they're more reliable technically with the piece, when they perform, when it really matters, when the stage fright and all that comes in play, then they feel more confident, and that confidence gives them that nano moment to react to the unexpected better, or as if it was planned. That's what I meant. Or it gives them also the opportunity to appear to enjoy the piece they perform, which connects the audience even more to their performing. It's more compelling to see somebody apparently enjoying what they do while struggling towards it, instead of seeing some people just struggle visually and disappoint themselves at the slightest mistake, because then you realize they are vulnerable and you feel uncomfortable watching them hurting themselves, so to say. Of course, thankfully not as an accident, as I said earlier, with a car or something. But serving the muse takes such courage and such know-how, that the more you gain the know-how, the more you gain the capacity to express what musically, psychologically, and emotionally, aesthetically you think the piece is. And you realize, today I managed to express myself a little more than I used to in this piece. Wow. Sometimes it might appear, seen from outside, as irrelevant detail. It's like, is it good or is it not good, man? No, it is, you gain it on yourself. It's almost you gain your self-respect when finally you can play a section in public and not mess it up, even if you attempted from different aspects of practicing before, and you didn't, until you found a fingering that allows you better to control it, and then you're less fearing that shifting, and then and you prepare, you anticipate, you touch, you the shifting tempo compared to the gestural tempo, and all these elements that you might have been told, like I tell them to my students, but I know they cannot implement them, like as if you push a button or download an app and you start playing, as if that existed. Perhaps it will one day, who knows. Scary thought. But the idea is that it takes a lifetime to shape one's character, one's personality, one's knowledge, one's scholarship. There's this spontaneous moment where you have to throw it in a single ephemeral performance and reach all the details while wanting to have all the line of the narrative story beautifully displayed and apparently glitchless. There's always somebody playing cleaner than you, and you always feel upset, and then it belittles you, and then you lose your courage and you don't want to practice, or what's the point? I'll never reach that level that I wish, I hoped, that I was told I might. Even if originally it was to please parents and teachers, then becomes to compete with yourself, compete with the others, and then after that to how to teach better. At all levels you try to prove to yourself that you know what it's about, this piece, beyond the notes and the right notes from the wrong notes, which should be not a given, but it should be at least an accepted base, not the point. Again, the message, not the messenger, right? And the trip's aim, the trip itself. When you're young, you don't like so much to practice because you're alone and boring, repetitive if bored. And when you get older and you start understanding better how to play, you like to have more time to practice because you start enjoying that carving of the details. Isn't it the seasons of life? So you try to inject wisdom, knowledge, and know-how to the students. That's why I started with the wisdom of practicing. The performing is the visible tip of the iceberg of the preparation of the for the performance. And if the student spend 20 years through the life of theirs with the piece periodically, and finally reaches what they think is what they wanted to do at best, or did they just learn it 3 weeks earlier, the audience doesn't know, doesn't care, because it's one time through, it's one life with all its beauty, emotion, silliness, unexpected and sometimes stupid things. I never made a mistake in this section, as many students tell me. Never. I always worried about the difficult sections, or the ones I usually don't make it every time because it's more iffy. But in such a section that I never thought I will make a mistake, that's the one and so that infuriates the student's self-esteem actually more than anything else. Like, how come I'm not reliable? How come it happened where it never happens? Is it the emotional level that overpowers the capacity of the brain to control and the emotion, or therefore to become the rational versus the emotional? But you don't serve notes, you serve emotions, you serve thoughts processes, you serve complicated, complex, beautiful, meaningful, crowded structures. If it's a fugue, a symphony, a sonata, whatever it is, and if you play with chamber musicians, you add to that with them adding to you, and you participate in a flow of events. It's not just it's cooking and running, and it's gymnastics, and as well as spiritual enlightenment. It's all in one. It's physical and structural, emotional and spiritual. And of course, if you served something that is emotionally not meaningful to you, and you're like not emotional, if not emotional, perhaps I'm overusing that word, of course I do overuse it. Let's say if you're less sensitive to this form of art, then you're more objectively able to serve it, but without great compelling inspiration. But paradoxically, when you know how much it means to you, and it moves you, it shakes you, it emotionally drives you or drains you, and then you have to remain on top of it as an independent conductor who never plays the instrument, but who instrumentally, so to say, conveys the musicians to play the best, each for their part, and you play each of these parts. You have to have, I don't know how many brains to control how many control things, plus the emotion. Not less. You don't want to funnel it and control it and lock it in a box and say, I'm not going to worry about the emotion, I'll just do the gymnastics part, not the spiritual part of the piece. I'm not going to let the piece emotionally overtake my rational organization of my playing of it. The industry of playing versus the inspiration of it. Because ultimately what you work towards when you practice a piece you love and you want to prove yourself and the audience that you're worthy of playing it, because that's what you elevate yourself towards, you make yourself better, is that you want to combine both. Not have the technique or the musicianship, as many people think it's two ingredients that you have to just then put together after you learn the notes and the rhythm, then you put it together, or you put the pedal and then the memorization and then the layers and then you perform it. Of course, that would be that's not true. It doesn't function that way. all the elements interact, and some of them distract, and some don't help you reach the point. Some impede you. You're your own enemy. Your left hand shifts too early or reaches a note that the right hand delays a little bit, and then all of a sudden the dominoes all fall. But if you played all aligned, it wouldn't make it rather better. It would even not sound more convincing musically. It was not meant to. It has to be this organized chaos, this planned dislocation of the melodic display compared to the harmonic display. And if it's only the trick of dislocating the notes, then it's no more interesting because it becomes predictable and artificial, or at best pedantic, or unnatural, or all of the above. When you play it and all of a sudden you seem to discover it and you enjoy how they match, and then for some reason, planned or on the moment, of course, if you have immediately the capacity to stop in the performance and to think, oh, was that too much? That would have been better. But that doesn't work like that in life. It doesn't work like that in acting life, on stage as an actor, live actor, not edited films, or in this case for music, edited recordings. No, you have to be able to say prose as if it's verse, to organize the detail as if you apparently let it just flow through you effortlessly. Effortlessly is perhaps not the right word, but without to show how much discipline it took to get there. Nobody wants to attend your performance to see how much you struggle and eventually disappoint yourself. Of course, you can cheat and try to put pedal and cover it up. Kids do that because they don't have the consciousness of what it means. But youngsters and then students, and then the more you are aware of what you need to reach, the more you realize how far it is. Perhaps you'll reach it at one section even, and you're already so disappointed for the next one if it doesn't work, instead of enjoying how much you reach. It's like running behind the horizon line on a field, but you cannot catch it. And you think, I run faster and I catch it. But somebody observing you on the side says, oh, you run faster. But you don't have the illusion that you do. I didn't progress. Of course you did. The teacher might say, not enough, too much, or right. But the student doesn't realize if they do. It's like you feel like you're constantly failing because all your attempts there's so many variables in the interpretation of the piece that can go wrong, that it's enough for one of them to go wrong for the whole thing to mean nothing. But in fact, it does mean a lot to most, even with the defect of this or that within the line. So what? That's life. You should be perfectionist. You should aim for it, but it shouldn't be on the detriment of the meaningful, musical, compelling inspiration. That's not empty words. It's the meaning of it all. So if you can put in your practicing, in that idea of the that I want to convey so much about the wise practicing, that you can inject the music in it and not separate it, but at the same time organize progressively your gesture technically to obtain it in the tempo by making them smaller as you progress in the tempo, from the slow practice, from the detail to the whole, from the micro to the macro. And remain always focused and concentrated ahead of what you play in order to anticipate the anticipation of the very industry of playing the section. So you enter in the section you're already in and not adjust into it as it's almost too late because the next one comes before you can prepare it, and then you run behind yourself, trying to catch yourself. And some pieces appear very long, and some are too short, and some are repetitive musically, and some are just evolving in ways that you feel like, if I don't catch it from the get-go, I cannot catch it on the run. And then I'm lost until the end. That's where the courage is. To dare start again and say, I'm going to try. Macro, micro, detail and all. Narrative and clean. Meaningful, emotional, or whatever the psychological message of the piece is there, unadulterated through the technique to the audience. And the audience is my chamber music partner when I'm a solo pianist. Of course, the silent, dead composer and former teachers of mine are the silent army with me. And we are here with the piece, through the instrument, regardless if it's the one of the time or not, because we want to go through the storytelling, through the life of its own, to the country of its own. You don't just play notes, you play notes in a country. The country of Fauré, the country of Schumann, the country of Beethoven. Come with me, audience. Let's visit together this beautiful sonata. Look, my transition will bring us to this most marvelous second theme on the mediant. Oh, that's unusual. Who cares? That's analytical. But the fact is that is not because of it, but is the way it is. That you have to respond to it as if you discover it, not surprised, or unless by some mistake of your own, but to give that artificial, educated spontaneity of a theater actor who always, every day, acts as if he discovers what it's about at the section or the moment of the place of the act of the at which moment of the storytelling of the theater play it is. Yes, practice, rehearse, play is deal with the unexpected, share with the audience is be in the heart of the piece, and expect that all this practicing doesn't lead you to play it like you practiced it as best when you have not the pressure of the stage fright and memorization and all these other elements, but that all the preparation of the practicing is there to allow you to play freed from the worries and let yourself only serve the music, like a ultimate dessert. You go through all the cooking to taste the dessert. I know it's a silly analogy, but all my analogies are silly anyway. Music cannot be translated. It's already a translation of our soul's yearning. So inevitably, it's, as Mademoiselle Boulanger would say, it's the language of music is its own language. It's what music is. Even if we add to it what it means to us in life as an emotion. I thank you very much for having partially or entirely stayed with me through me loud voice, sharing with you all my thoughts about practicing and performing wisely. Wishing great enjoyments to those of you who do, and great courage for those who will do, because it's worth it, even if it's ephemerally short, the moment where things just come to be as we dream them to be. And don't let anybody discourage you of that pursuit. As immaterial as it looks, as childish as it appears, to chase some kind of uncatchable daydream, because you'll never catch it, and nobody does, except pedantic people who pretend that they're specialist of this, knowledgeable of that, blah 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 blah. It is true that you reach a level of discerning knowledge, but that still doesn't hold much during the one-time performance, which in a way is the result of all of this, or as much of it that can fit in it harmoniously, blends, flows. I wish you to have the same courage and the same determination and the same enjoyments that are given to all of us who dare dream and work for our dreams.